In the early 20s, Germany made a bet. It decided to invest in an industry that barely existed. Offshore wind was expensive, technically difficult, and filled with uncertainty. Turbines had to survive violent storms, corrosive salt water, and some of the harshest conditions imaginable. Many doubted it would ever become a source of electricity. And yet, Germany kept building, projects after projects, year after year. 2 decades later, that gamble has transformed entire regions of the country. Now another nation stands at a crossroad. South Africa has the wind. It has the coastline. It has the growing need for new electricity sources. But here's the question. Can South Africa learn from Germany's offshore journey and build something even better? This is what we're going to try to answer in this episode. My name is Ken. You're watching The African Grid. Germany did not wake up one morning and decided to build thousands of offshore wind turbines. What we see today is the result of more than 3 decades of planning, experimentation, policy design, and infrastructure investment. The story actually begins in 1990. At that time, offshore wind was not even part of the conversation. Germany's first major step was the Stromeinspeisungsgesetz. You can think of it as the Electricity Feed-in Act. It was the country's first law requiring utilities to purchase renewable electricity. By itself, it did not create an offshore wind industry, but it created something even more important: trust. For the first time, investors could believe that renewable energy would have a place in Germany's energy future. A decade later, Germany doubled down. The Renewable Energy Sources Act was introduced in the 20s and strengthened in 24 and 25. This law guaranteed renewable energy producers a fixed price for every unit of electricity they produced over a period of 20 years. That may sound boring, but without this simple idea, Germany's renewable energy revolution would have probably never happened. Yet there was still a problem. Germany wanted to build wind farms far offshore, in deeper waters, exposed to some of the harshest weather conditions in Europe. But nobody knew enough. So instead of rushing into construction, Germany first invested in knowledge. In 2022, the government launched the THENO research program. By the summer of 2023, THENO 1 was already collecting critical meteorological and ecological data in the North Sea. Then more research platforms followed. THENO 2 became operational in the Baltic Sea in 2007 and THENO 3 followed in 2009. For years, Germany first studied the water before trying to industrialize it, and that decision will prove crucial later. On April 27, 2010, Germany commissioned VENTUS, its first offshore wind farm with 12 turbines, 60 megawatts installed capacity, and located around 60 kilometers offshore in the North Sea. By today's standards, it was tiny. The turbines delivered around 5 megawatts each and used rotor diameter of around 126 meters. But VENTUS was never about size. It was about proving that offshore wind could work in German water. And once that question was answered, the challenge changed completely. Germany quickly realized that building turbines was only half of the challenge. Electricity still had to reach customers hundreds of kilometers away. In 2011, the Federal Maritime and Hydrographic Agency launched the first federal offshore planning framework. Instead of letting offshore wind developers build whatever they wanted, the idea was to designate offshore zones, coordinate grid connections, and plan future projects years in advance. Then another major shift arrived in 2017. The Offshore Wind Agency was introduced. The objective was clear: centralize planning, reduce uncertainty, and prepare the offshore wind energy sector for industrial-scale deployment. In the same year, Germany also moved away from traditional feed-in tariffs and introduced the competitive auction systems. Between 2018 and 2021, the country entered a period of rapid industrial growth. New projects came online, supply chains matured, manufacturing scaled up, and turbine technology evolved at breathtaking speed. The average offshore wind turbine that entered service in 2010 produced roughly 5 megawatts. By 2019, newly installed turbines averaged almost 7 megawatts. The industry that began with just 12 turbines now represents one of the largest offshore wind markets in the world. And this is where South Africa enters the story. While Germany spent decades building an offshore wind industry, South Africa faces a very different challenge. Not a lack of wind, but a lack of renewable electricity. In 2023, South Africa experienced one of the worst electricity crises in its history. Load shedding occurred on 287 days. Nearly 25 terawatt-hours of electricity demand could not be served. This alone is estimated to have cost the South African economy between 2.8 and 2.9 trillion rand. In fact, South Africa's electricity system remains heavily dependent on aging coal plants. And even though maintenance efforts have improved performance during 2024, the system remains vulnerable. This raises an important question. If South Africa needs more renewable electricity, where could it come from? The answer may be just offshore wind energy. South Africa possesses one of the largest offshore wind resources on the planet. Current estimates suggest around 49 gigawatts of fixed-bottom offshore wind potential in relatively shallow waters. But that is only half of the story. According to the Energy Sector Management Assistance Program, floating offshore wind resources could reach approximately 589 gigawatts. This might be enough energy to power the entire South African economy multiple times over. So the opportunity is enormous, but that doesn't mean that every gigawatt should be built tomorrow. A more realistic pathway would focus first on the 49 gigawatts of shallow water potential that can already be developed using proven fixed-bottom technology. Because most of South African offshore wind resources is located in deeper waters, exploiting these areas will eventually require floating wind technology. The problem is that floating offshore wind remains expensive and still emerging globally. Financing also remains a challenge. First-of-kind projects remain risky and require support from development finance institutions, commercial banks, and international investors willing to back a new market. But South Africa is not starting from zero. In fact, many strong foundations already exist. The Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program has already contracted approximately 3.5 gigawatts of onshore wind capacity across 34 projects. This demonstrates something very important. Renewable energy systems in South Africa are already bankable. Developers know how to build them. Investors know how to finance them, and local expertise already exists. The Electricity Regulation Amendment Act, which took effect in January 2025, introduced a more competitive electricity market and established an independent transmission system operator. In other words, South Africa has already started building the institutions needed for a future offshore wind industry. Now, what can be learned from Germany's pathway? In fact, Germany's experience offered three important lessons. First, price certainty. I think South Africa should just copy this one. Germany's Renewable Energy Sources Act gave investors confidence through long-term revenue guarantees. South Africa should finalize and institutionalize its offshore wind roadmap so that developers can make investment decisions with confidence. Second, South Africa could adapt Germany's approach to spatial planning and create its own version of FINO projects. Many years before the first turbine was built, Germany had already started gathering meteorological information on sea. This was an important step, and I think South Africa should also follow that pathway. Also important, Germany's Federal Maritime and Hydrographic Agency pre-surveyed sites. It coordinates permits and centralized offshore planning. South Africa could create a unified permitting framework between the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy and the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment to accelerate project development and reduce uncertainty. Then, my third proposition should be to avoid Germany's great mistakes. Germany learned the hard way that building wind farms is often easier than connecting them. South Africa's new transmission system operator must prioritize costly grid upgrade before large offshore wind projects begin construction. And if there's just one lesson that Germany cheats above all others, it is this one. Offshore wind is not built by turbines alone. It's a combination of planning, policy, and infrastructure. And most importantly, it is built years before the first turbine even touches the water. What about you? Do you think the successful deployment of South Africa's offshore wind energy sector in the coming decades is utopian? I am excited to read your thoughts in the comment section. It was Ken, your African energy guy. See us in the next video.